So, hello from me, Carol Craig. A welcome to this second book group event on Plays the Way. I'm chairing this because I'm the publisher of the series. I'm the commissioning editor for Postcards from Scotland and absolutely delighted to be publishing this particular volume. I'm on the board of Upstart as well. And I think not only is it a terrific book, but it's increasingly influential. So really delighted that we're doing this book group series. So the first of our speakers is Pam Jarvis. And she's going to be talking about the myth of early acceleration, the name of her chapter. I hope she's going to talk about wardrobes and coat hangers, because I particularly loved that metaphor in that chapter. Pam is a chartered psychologist, historian, and qualified teacher. After a career in academia, she's currently Honorary Research Fellow at Leeds Trinity University. Her extensive academic publishing includes perspectives on play, very relevant for tonight. She blogs in various media, including the TES and Yorkshire Bylines, and is working on her first novel, which explores her Scottish ancestry. So over to you, Pam.
I'm going to have a quick whiz through what I call brain building for beginners, which is how children's brains are constructed from the very beginning, which obviously has a relevance to how they learn. We don't know everything there is to know about brains yet, and it will take us a lot more time to work that out. I think at least a century, probably more than that. But at the moment, what we know is it takes 25 years to build a neuronal adult. You're not actually fully mature in terms of your brain biology until you're 25. But within that, there are these two periods where we have the most intensive neural connection programs going on, which is the early years of life, most particularly birth to 3, and adolescence, which is another interesting phase, but we're not going to cover that today. The most important concept that you really need to know for the early years of life is this concept of blooming and pruning. And what that means is that when children are first born and taking notice, what happens is the neurons in the brain start connecting very, very quickly. When I was teaching my students, I often used to say, I don't know if you remember Little Britain, but the guy in the wheelchair who used to go around saying, "I want that one." Well, babies' brains are a bit like that. Whatever they see, they want that one. They want to know, they want to look, they want to actually make a connection because that's interesting. But the problem with this is that there has to also be selection in terms of what is most important. And although we bloom and prune throughout our lives, there's a huge amount of blooming in the first 3 years. And in the 3 years following that, then there's quite a bit of pruning that goes on when children start to work out what is the most important things that they need to know to get on in their world and things that are not quite so important. It's how we learn to pay attention, basically, to the thing that we need to pay attention to, among other things. And if you have a look at this slide, what you can see is the very sparse neuronal connections at birth. But what's that's not surprising, but what's quite interesting is that when we get to 6 years, we can see all this tangle of neurons all connected up. But by the time we get to 14, we've actually got rather less. And this is down to the specialization issue. So here's the point. When they first come into the world, children create these huge number of neuronal pathways during initial interactions. They don't know what's important or what to choose, they just connect. But then as time goes by, some of the pathways are pruned and others are strengthened on the basis of how much they're used. And what you can, if you look at these two pictures, you can see this is basically a field at the back of my house where you can see that you can just about see on the top one that people do walk across a particular pathway on that particular piece of grass, but it's not so obvious. But when you look at the one below, you can absolutely see that people constantly walk across this particular pathway at the bottom. And that's what happens in terms of strengthening neuronal pathways. It's literally a traffic issue. So some of these pathways that children are actually creating go on to become the equivalent of a motorway. Others are they're good, broad, maintained roads, but others are just simple traces. So there's a lot of work to do on the brain in those first 6 years. Now, one of the problems that adults create for children is if they keep shoving stuff into their heads, when children don't have those specific and working neural pathways to hang them on. And what, again, I started doing this with my students, was talk about, well, you know, if you've got a wardrobe, and students often do this, and you bring in your clothes and just throw them on the floor. And of course, in a group of students, you've usually got a few of them go, yeah, you know. And I said, well, how difficult then is when you want to get a dress, for a party dress or something, if you've just brought it in and shoved it in the bottom of the wardrobe and it's all jumbled up with your t-shirts and your jeans, how difficult is it to find it? Well, very difficult. So this is what happens if you keep relentlessly inputting information into children's brains when they're not mature enough to actually be able to hang the thoughts in any kind of order. And this is what we're doing in early years. We're actually creating these stimulating environments where children can choose what they do and adults are organizing. We're not relentlessly trying to input things into their brains, like taking a memory stick and shoving it into a computer in ways that make sense to us, but actually don't make sense to them because they're not quite there yet in terms of being able to pick up on what an adult is saying and connect it to something they know already. So this is what we do with children in an early years environment where they're working in a very free flow way, and an adult comes up and says, that's interesting, what are you doing? And the child says, oh, you know, I'm putting up a sign to say that the train can't go down here. Well, yeah, okay, so what's on the sign? And that kind of thing, just bringing out what they're already thinking and giving them some more thoughts that they already have hangers to put them on and coordinate them. So here's the bottom line. If you put children in a socially embedded environment using techniques and words and things that they already know, using resources that are familiar to them, they start to organize this understanding of the world and who they are and what their place is. What that does is support that construction and coordination of neural connections within the brain, because you're actually hanging one thing on top of another on top of another. If you like, you're helping them to put their skirts in one place, their jeans in another place, and their party dresses in another place. As children know more and more and more, they become much more able to be quite flexible about how they use words, terminology. For example, things, say, organising cats, the domestic cats, tigers, that kind of thing. All of this happens gradually as they meet ideas within their in their everyday world. They start also to be able to understand wordplay, like, you know, well, what's a blackberry? Do you eat it, or is it something that you use as a phone? You know, that kind of thing. Now, here's the problem. What we're doing if we're treating children like we can just put anything in and they're supposed to remember it, is we're trying to rev an engine, accelerate an engine that actually isn't actually built yet. So, you know, as you put your foot on the accelerator, then, you know, you're going to find that it doesn't go as fast, and perhaps, you know, in the end you're going to break something because it's not quite ready to do that yet. That's uncomfortable for the adult, it's uncomfortable for the child, and it will create stress, because if you're making expectations of them that they can't meet, that's very stressful for them. They feel that they've disappointed adults and they don't know why, but they feel they can't do what you want them to do. Once you stress a child in education, you start a whole hormonal stress problem going that actually stops them learning. I mean, you imagine, I'm sure everybody here has had a situation where they've been into an exam, they can't answer a question and they panic. And the fact that you panic means you're even less likely to be able to answer the question because you're panicking. Your brain is actually dealing with that stress reaction. So accelerating children isn't only useless, it's actually damaging because it's creating a stress reaction that has the opposite effect to the one that's intended. It makes them less likely to be able to do what you're asking them to do. I think people rather liked this. I know Sue, I think, rather liked this analogy. I think, you know, this picture, I wish that we could present this to the government ministers, you know, in the Parliament, because I'm sure, you know, they must have had experience of being overloaded and panicking. I'm sure that must happen, you know, many times if you're trying to deal with government business, and actually trying to explain to them, well, if you go too fast with children too early, that you're actually creating a problem in what you're trying to do. And I don't know how far Scotland's got with this idea of what they call cognitive learning theory and making children memorize things. But if we look at the developing brain, this is utter nonsense. It's building itself. You can't just put in a memory where the actual pathways to hang the memory on don't exist. In some ways, maybe this isn't such a great picture because the wardrobe is too small and the human brain is never too small. It will have the hangers, but, you know, you've got to build them.
Okay, Pam, thank you very much indeed. I think this is absolutely critical to understanding the whole book and why a kindergarten phase is something that we need. So thank you very much, Pam. Let's move on now to Sue Palmer, who's going to be talking about literacy matters, but building strong foundations for literacy matters more. Now, Sue, I don't think really requires a lot of introduction, but she was a former primary head teacher, literary consultant, and author whose interest in child development arose through research for toxic childhood, 21st century boys and 21st century girls. And it led to the publication then of her book, Upstart, the case for raising the school starting age. She was a founding member of Upstart Scotland and is now its chair. And apart from writing a chapter for Play is the Way, she's also the editor. So over to you, Sue.
Right, well, that's the title that I've given to my talk, because that's the title of the chapter I wrote for Play is the Way. And most people know me, I think, in Scotland as the chair of Upstart, and I'm associated with early years, but actually I've only recently discovered early years, called a literacy consultant in a prior life. So I've shoved my literacy credentials up there so that, you know, I actually, you know, do have some qualifications to talk about it. It was actually when I started working for England's national literacy strategy at a sort of government level that I began to wonder about everything I'd ever done before. Because what we literacy people were concerned about is that the why and the how of literacy teaching. And actually, we were doing pretty well on that. I think I like to think now that a lot of the debates that had gone on in the past have more or less been settled, because I think there's a reasonable consensus about what's important. How you go about doing it, that's another matter, but I think the literacy people are pretty well in agreement. The thing was, we'd never asked another really important question. And actually, it was becoming clearer and clearer to me as the years went by that we were starting it all much too early. And that was getting worse and worse, because the more you do sort of targets and testing, the more there's a drive to start earlier. It just becomes a sort of competitive business. And of course, we're very, very weird in the UK. It was only when I started looking into this and finding out about this, I realized that it's really only ex-members of the British Empire and Albania that start school before the age of 6. The rest of the world wouldn't dream of sending children to school. We send them. And the reason we do it, it's nothing to do with education. It was a decision taken in the Westminster government in the 1860s. Reason being, they wanted to get the children into school as early as possible when compulsory school began, so that their mums could go and work in the factories. And also, the sooner the children started in school, the sooner they could come out the other end, and they could go to work in the factories as well. So it was nothing to do with what was known about child development. But we all read that people, Frebel had had his school going for some time, and there'd been a lot of found out way before 1860. So no, they weren't listening to education. They were concerned with economics, as they tend to be. If you look at what the United Nations says in terms of the UNCRC, they define early childhood as actually going to 8. And that means we're sending our children, many of them, half to school, halfway through their early childhood, which, considering the UNESCO and the UNCRC say that it's actually supposed to be more than a preparation for primary school. It's supposed to be about the holistic development, sort of thing Pam has just beautifully described, of a child's social, emotional, cognitive and physical needs to build that foundation for lifelong learning and well-being. And of course, in Scotland, we actually do have an early level in our curriculum for excellence, which is developmental in nature, and which we should mean, since it goes to the end of P1 when they're 6 going on 7, should work. But of course, because of the school starting age being at 5, well, the year they turn 5, so that I think most children are 4.5 when they start school. I don't know, but anyway, at that very tender age, they have to leap across that great divide from the nursery into a primary classroom. And of course, once they're in a primary classroom, they're in school. And no matter it's still the early level, if they're in school, people think of them as being school children. So, for instance, when the First Minister decides that she's going to introduce Scottish National Standardised Assessments, literacy and numeracy, she thinks, so we'll have our baseline at the beginning of school. That's P1. Nobody told her that it's not the right time for children to be starting literacy and numeracy. Of course, as soon as you've got national assessments, that's what people concentrate on. That's what the local authorities are going to be collecting data on. That's what parents are worried about. So it starts putting that pressure on schools and on teachers and then on children to get started on this stuff at that age group. As they always have, actually, because that's when they start school. And the reasoning behind the First Minister's decision was part of the National Improvement Framework, because everybody had got so worried. We knew there was an attainment gap at the age of 5 between children from low-income households and children from high-income households, and they wanted to tackle that. But of course, the way to tackle it is not to go in all guns blazing on literacy and numeracy. It's to do the sorts of things that are done in a good kindergarten setting. You'd have a literacy and maths rich environment. You just make sure there's stuff around, as there is in the high-income households, that would ensure that children are getting the sorts of input they need, all children. And of course, the play right at the centre of it. On sustained shared thinking, that's talk, opportunities to chat about interesting things that are happening, or about the stories you've heard, or about plans you're making. Just that opportunity to develop language, because the vocabulary is the thing that they're assessing. Yeah, the usual sorts of activities that nursery people are using to develop children's creativity. Although I have to say, the play itself, particularly when it's outdoors and in nature, the play itself is a vehicle for curiosity and creativity, but we can sort of build on that with the art and the drama and the music. I mean, that's what we should be doing. And if a child has not, from the low income homes, if a child does not have that for the first 3 years of their life, you want to make sure that they get it for at least the next 3. It's not as if the children from the high income homes who are already showing an interest in reading and writing would be held back. No, you'd support and encourage that. You just wouldn't make a thing of it. And then once they reach the age of 6 or 7, well, I think 6.5 was probably ideal, but once they do start school, most children probably have already started wanting to read and write and therefore be ready for a sort of fairly systemized introduction to the how bit that we all know about so well. That's my, I mean, you can find all this out in the book, but that's my rough description of a literacy-rich environment. But that's what we've got in Scotland at the moment. That's the benchmarks for children's achievement at the end of primary 1. That's a selection of them. There's a lot more in literacy. They were plucked from the air. Actually, I think they were plucked from the EYFS. I think they just rewrote them very slightly. When we introduced the Scottish National Standardised Assessments, and that's what people, they look on the internet, will see is expected by the end of P1, or is it, you know, the sort of thing you quite like. So of course, that's the sort of thing they try to aim for. And it's the sort of thing, it's symbolic, abstract, symbolic information. It's very difficult for a child to manipulate until they have had all that other stuff that builds the broad and sound foundation. So actually, we're driving the gap. Having such an early school starting age means that many children, sadly, because of that stress that Pam was talking about, because they're put under emotional stress and they fail, and they build up on top of whatever it is that's the problem in the first place, they build up an emotional resistance to reading and never quite get there. Others cope, they manage, but it's not something that they really like doing because, again, of the stress and the fact that it wasn't easy to start with. So they don't engage in all the practice you need, and that neuronal network building, as Pam was making clear, it's practice. You have to walk across that pathway thousands, millions of times. And automaticity in reading, which is what you need for proper comprehension, automaticity in writing, so that you can just get your ideas straight out. These things actually take an enormous amount of practice. You want to be able to look at text and immediately read it. You don't have to think, it just happens. And the same with writing. It takes practice. And if they're not engaging in it, then it's going to be very, very shaky foundations indeed. And we're doing it. That's their one purpose. Fortunately, we now have a very good practice guidance document for the whole of early level. And Carol let us do Plays the Way this summer to back that up and try to get the information out. And as we speak at the moment, the Scottish Parliament is debating for the first time ever whether Scotland should have a kindergarten stage. But because our culture is so embedded in sending children to school at a very early age, I'm pretty sure it will just be a bit of a debate tonight. What we hope is that as time goes on, our politicians and our policymakers will gradually come to understand that childhood is not erased. And I'll just leave you with that lovely bit of internet wisdom, which I think it sort of sums it all up.
Okay, that was about 10 minutes, Sue, but it was great, and I wouldn't have wanted to interrupt you. Right, let's move on then. The third speaker is Helen Williams. Now, Helen hasn't written a chapter for the book, but she's standing in for Juliet Robertson, who has, and unfortunately can't be with us this evening because she's unwell, and I'm sure you'll join with me in sending Juliet our good wishes for her speedy recovery. Helen advised Juliet, I think she did, on aspects of her chapter, which is called The 5 R's of Maths, Developing a Firm Mathematical Foundation in the Early Years. Now, since 1994, Helen's been an independent educational consultant specializing in developing the teaching and learning of primary mathematics. In July 2014, she completed her doctorate with the University of Roehampton, London. It's called The Relevance of Role Play to the Learning of Mathematics in the Primary Classroom. She's taught children maths across the full primary range. So over to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you, Carol, and thank you. Well, that's really lovely to be here, and it is an utter privilege to be asked to speak about in relation to Juliet's chapter. So thank you for asking me. I am passionate about early years maths, and I want to talk just for a little while about what we know about it. And I'm talking about mathematics. I'm not talking about numeracy. I'm talking about mathematics. And what we do know is that early mathematics is very important, and that even though I think there is still a school of thought that it might not be appropriate for very young children to get engaged in mathematics, we know that they are very capable of thinking mathematically and solving problems and answering mathematical problems that are interesting to them. We know that. We also know that we have a massive problem in our countries in terms of how people feel about mathematics. People are very negative about it, and I've spent the last 20x years working with teachers and practitioners who have been sent on maths courses because they've had their arms twisted, or they were at the bottom of the heap, or they were away when people chose the CPD, and so they got landed with the maths. And so dealing with that sort of negativity and trying to help people feel as passionate as I am about it. Now, my maths experience was hideous. I mean, I hated maths at school, and I was determined that I wasn't going to recycle that with my children, which has made me very interested in how children get interested in mathematics, and they do get interested in it. They are interested in it, like they are interested in everything else. And the key is in how it's presented, of course. So I am going to just show you, I'm going to introduce you to Mervin and his friends from a school in England. So here's Mervin and his friends, and I'm going to play it. It's 47 seconds, as you can see. And I hope there's enough there for you to get a glimpse of what's going on here.
Put another one in, then we have two, and put one there, then we have one, then we put the last one in here, and now we have the last one in here. No, in here. And then we have none. If we take one out, we have four in, then we take two more out, then we take the last one out, and then we have the dodo. Fine.
So there's Mervin and his friends, and if you were in a CPD session with me now, we would have the two questions that I would be asking you is, what do you notice about that, and what do you wonder about that? How has it actually come about, and what has led to that happening? Because if you could hear what was going on there, you've got some children doing some counting upwards and backwards in their own self-initiated play. They've built a sort of an enclosure, and in and out go the dinosaurs. And despite the fact there are three of them put in and out, they are still, Mervin's still able to hang on to the fact that he's got 5, then he's got 4, then he's got 3, then he's got 2. Mervin's in his first term of reception there. So one of the first things I notice, because there's too many of you to ask you what you notice, although if you put the stuff in the chat, that would be just lovely, is that what we do in early years is we do it huge or we do it outdoors. Now that is a Sue Gifford phrase, do it huge, do it outdoors. And I know that if Juliet was here, she would be saying the same thing. There is so much. Every time I'm shown an image of some children doing some maths, they're sat at a blooming table, and it's like, no, it really doesn't have to be like that at all. So move over, bold beginnings. If you weren't landed with that, we were in England, and we're still fighting it. So do it huge, do it outdoors is one of the best things. Now I also want to show you, and I'm actually a little bit embarrassed about showing you this video, so this is a little bit longer. I want you to show you this little bit is an indoor activity, because I think Esther, whose child this is in her class. Esther O'Connor is actually here today. And this is Isaac, and he's 3 years and 7 months. And this is, and Esther works in Belgium. So I'm going to do a share screen again, and I'm going to show you Isaac, and just spend a little time with Isaac, who is at a table and indoors. And the same thing, what do you notice and what do you wonder? Here is Isaac.
What do you notice about this then, is that? What can you tell me?
3 lots of 3. There's 3, 3, 3, there's 3 3s.
Oh, 3 groups of 3. And oh, how many would I have as a whole if there's 3 groups of 3?
It's 9.
Okay, I wonder, will this have the same?
No, it won't.
Why not?
It will have 5 makes 25.
Oh, let's see if your prediction is right.
So there's Isaac, and what I just think that is remarkable. And in fact, he is remarkable. But what is notable is that this is about provision. This is about provision and the space that we give children to think, and the resources that we give them to think with, so that they are able to make those predictions and play with the ideas that they have got there. You've got some lovely square tiles there fitting into a frame. And the first thing that struck me, did you see how he counted 8 tiles, and then he corrected himself to 9 because he knew there weren't 8 there. It didn't make sense to him. And so I'm going to read you a quote there. So Peter Lacey is a very dear friend of mine and a very, very amazing maths educator. And he said once, an enlightened society should be striving to describe a curriculum for the mathematician rather than for mathematics. And that is what we need to do. What do our young mathematicians need? They need the interwovenness of exploration and play and goal-oriented tasks. They need input from adults, but they need sensitive input from adults that's sandwiched with time for them to make sense of the ideas and the resources and the images and everything that's going on with them. For all of those firings to happen that Pam was talking about, for them to make the connections between the things that are already going on in their amazing heads. And finally, I just wanted to mention that, how does a love of maths happen? A love of maths happens when we recognize the classroom or the setting as an emotional as well as a cognitive space. It's an emotional space because what happens there engenders great, huge emotions in us. I mean, I'm sure if I asked you, I had people queuing up on courses and saying, I had a horrible, I felt dreadful about maths. It made me feel awful, like this teacher made me do this. And I come out really depressed, and they all go out feeling marvelous because they've unloaded everything. But cognition and emotion affect your learning. So we need to create shared mathematical experiences for us all to discuss and enjoy. We need to develop mathematical communities with our families and our carers where we all feel safe and confident to make statements, make predictions, make mistakes, and take time to think about things. Otherwise, we end up with, as Anita Straker said once, there's a danger that mathematics is seen by children as something in which they learn about what other people think, other people's ideas, particularly yours, and that it has nothing to do with them. And it's everything to do with them, as Isaac and Mervyn have shown us so clearly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, for that. Now, we've done not badly on time. Now, what about Kate? Kate's been looking at the chat box and has been accumulating questions. So, Kate, would you like to say what some of these are?
Nobody's asked any questions on the chat box, but I think there must be lots and lots and lots. And I want to just ask, at the Fribble Trust conference at the weekend, there was an amazing presentation on slow pedagogy. And I feel that this is what nursery does. It allows children to immerse themselves in their interest and then have it extended. So do you feel that we need to talk about this more in relation to literacy and numeracy?
So?
Well, yes. Completely, it's not a race. It's. I mean, I just loved what Helen was saying then. Thanks so much, Helen, because the enthusiasm infectious, but it is love. And if you fall in love with something, it might be at first sight, but it might take a long time to get to know it well enough and to just feel that it's not a pressure. And it's exactly the opposite. So yeah.
What are the benefits of a kindergarten stage to a dyslexic child, to dyslexic children? And this was put on Twitter today.
It's different. I mean, I can answer what the benefit of a kindergarten stage is, but I don't think it's a benefit to all children. I guess children who have, relative special needs, they don't immediately get their confidence slammed out of them in a situation like that. Because they're, engaging in things that make sense to them. So I think trying to teach 4-year-olds to read is a very, very difficult thing to do, because Sue can come in here, she's literacy expert, but the vast majority of them, their mind is not ready for that. So some of them it will be, but I think it's generally a minority. And if you're doing that with a child who has dyslexia or any kind of special need, it's just coming down harder on them. We have tremendous problems with this in the English education system, because special needs is poorly served across the board. Primary, secondary, you name it, that there's an expectation that children will all be, marching like little robots and learning the same thing at the same time, and it doesn't work. Sue wants to say something specifically about dyslexia.
Yeah, well, I taught lots of dyslexic children during the time I was working in literacy, and what I discovered very early on, and it wasn't just dyslexic children, I had children with attention deficit disorder, children were on the spectrum, children with dyspraxia, and with all of them, it seemed to me that a lot of the problems they had were not specifically, the thing they'd been diagnosed with. A lot of the problems were that they hadn't been able to do something when they were younger. And because they hadn't been able to do it, they had got more and more uptight, exactly what Pam was saying, more and more anxious, finding the whole thing of failing, repeatedly failing, and feeling that people were disappointed in them. That was the thing that was holding them back the most, which is why it seems to me only sensible to give a reasonably long period, exactly as the UN says, it's 0 to 8, during which you don't put these pressures on children, because that neuronal, the holistic thing, it's going to be different in every child, how you get to the sorts of particular skills and capacities that are going to help you really want to get into maths or really want to get into literacy. And we need to give them the time for that to happen. And of course, a supportive environment, which would be relationship-centered and play-based. So it seems to me so obvious. I don't think most children who are nowadays diagnosed as dyslexic would have that much of a problem if they'd had the time to come to reading with the support they need when they were little.
Okay. Anyone else want to answer that? Helen, would you like to say?
Well, I don't know much about dyslexia. It's not my field, but I think the issue, particularly from the maths point of view, is that there's been a kind of a if the children just play, you know, maths is all around them, and they kind of it kind of comes in through their pores or something. I don't know. And the other side is, you know, they're not interested in it, and it's something we should do much later. And I think both of those views are wrong, because I think they underestimate the powers of young children to think rationally and reason and predict, and also I think it doesn't. Research shows that maths just doesn't happen. I mean, my without it just be with it being. I mean, that was my PhD was looking at role play, because all the evidence was that no matter how much time you spend setting up shops, most children just steal things or stuff them in bags, and no one's paying and getting change or whatever it is that you've got on as your learning intention. So it was like, how do we work with children who are playful, and how do we do that playfully, and to help introduce them to things as well as watch what they're doing. So I like to think of it as listening to and listening for. So I'm listening to those children, and I'm listening for the things that I can pick up on, and for other things that I think are telling me about that child. So there's those two things have to work together. And I think that those sort of so I think the question, wasn't it, about what difference would it make a kindergarten system? Well, what will make the difference is developmentally appropriate provision. That's what, and people that are well trained in child development and knowledgeable about the trajectories of learning. That's what's going to make a difference to every single child. And children labelled far too young as being this or that or the other. Anyway, there you are. That's what I think.
Okay. I see on the chat box, how can we ensure thoughts and talk of catching up as we come out the other side of the pandemic don't set us back? Do people want to talk about that? Because it's been in the news a lot, hasn't it? The catch up idea.
Catching up with who?
Catching up.
That would be my question.
Can I just say that if anyone's interested, we've got a very good blog on it at the moment from someone from Montessori and on the Upstart website, because it is a real concern that the children are hearing messages which are not in their interest. And I think Pam, what do you think about it? The whole catch-up narrative.
First of all, I want Williamson. And you're Swinney, isn't it, to tell us who we're actually catching up with, because they've all been on lockdown, and the whole world has been on lockdown. So who are we catching up with? What's the issue? And I think a lot of this comes from the programming mentality, that we program children with X information every year. It's cumulative. We have, a memory stick for reception and a memory stick for year one, and they have to get through it. And if they don't get through it, then there's something wrong with them. And the standard has already been set of what they're supposed to know. And if they, don't know whatever it is they're supposed to know, then they need to catch up. But what is the point in them catching up if they actually don't understand it, if it's just something that they're supposed to have committed to memory? So to me, I'd actually really like to put one of them on the spot and do an interview and say, okay, can you actually now tell me what do you want them to catch up with? Is it a fronted adverbial? Is it, what's the catching up? Explain. But I mean, a lot of this, is political rhetoric anyway.
Seemingly, today in Parliament at the debate, Mary Todd spoke and said that if we implement realising the ambition properly, then there's no need for a kindergarten stage.
Did anyone point out that if we have testing and benchmarks in Q1, it is impossible to implement realising the ambition properly because of the pressures from all directions for children to be making this sort of constant progress in literacy and numeracy? It's like
Oh.
it's like they think with the two halves of their brain completely separate. There's no.
Sushi also said, Kathy's just said that no child should do the assessment if, hold on 1 minute, if they're not ready for it.
Who decides if they're not ready for it?
Who
Well,
decides
I mean, if
what
the
the
teacher
assessment-
had the option, that would be fine. But I imagine the option's not going to be with the teacher.
I thought the teachers did decide.
No, the school decides it's going to happen. You don't.
No, because they do. Anyway.
I think the head teacher makes the decision on whether their school is going to participate.
In England, they just have to take the assessment, and then if they fail, they fail.
Well, we had terrible trouble when the assessments were first brought in, because they said that parents were not allowed to withdraw their children if they wanted to. And, you know, there have been all sorts of quibbles. I'm very glad Marie Todd said that they shouldn't be if they're not ready, because actually nobody's ready to be assessed in literacy and numeracy under the age of about 8. That's what the World Economic Foundation reckons, and what they think in Singapore and China. I mean, they're not ready for that sort of thing.
You don't labour as much under this knowledge curriculum idea, do you? Which is
No.
absolutely destroying education in England.
Yeah, that is actually what I was going to say about that whole thing about catching up. That's about stuff, isn't it? It's about how much stuff you can get in the wall. That's what that's about. That's not about helping a child recover or starting from where a child is and building on that. It's about stuff, and it's about stuff because they can test stuff. And we just have to keep talking about it, and we just have to keep buggering on. I mean, it's just, you know, there's no alternative at the moment.
There's lots of chat in the chat box about the SNSAs changing what happens in nurseries as well as in primary school, from one of our other authors, Lisa. And Julie Fisher's come in, is the shift that happens when children move into primary, from self-directed to more adult-directed tasks. And if you've got one teacher and so many children, sadly, you know, and that's not what we envisage for a kindergarten stage, is it?
The big problem, of course, is, I mean, as well as a shift of place, so that very often there's not the same access to the outdoors, and a shift of ethos because you're in a school, and the emphasis, for instance, on literacy and numeracy. There's also the change of the adult-child ratio from 1 adult to 8 children in nursery to 1 adult to 20 children in school. And that's one of the things that in the chapter Kate and I did about how we get a kindergarten stage. We were looking at how can you manage to sort of juggle things so that abruptness of change doesn't happen, and also so that the age group 3 to 7, which is a group of children of ages that naturally throughout the history of the species has been together, because the mum would no longer be looking after them once they're about 2.5, she'll have another baby, and around about 7 most children would have gone to work. So that age group played out together, and they helped, the big ones helped the little ones, and the little ones learned from the big ones. And from the social aspect, that's really important. So there's all sorts of things about that business of getting a kindergarten stage, which would be to children's advantage in every possible respect.
I suggest that people look at the chat box and see that Ellie Dipper has put a quote from Gavin Williamson there. Unbelievable. I mean, it's now, sorry, I can't see it anymore, but it's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's terrible, because it came after our What If conference discussion last week. He said the government, this is England of course, the government will be backing teachers in ensuring children return to a disciplined, safe and orderly environment. We know much more now about what works best. Evidence-backed traditional teacher-led lessons with children seated facing the expert at the front of the class are powerful tools for enabling a structured learning environment where everyone flourishes.
Dear God.
And unfortunately, because that stuff's coming up from England all the time, even though, you know, we have a much more sensible attitude up here, that's what's getting in the papers. That's what people read and that's what they hear. So the parents think that, oh, well, that's what it was like when I was at school. Maybe that's what we need.
And Suzanne's commenting in the chat box about how, and she quotes somebody, maybe she'd come on and say this quote.
I'm here. I quoted in the chat, and I've put in a reference if people want to read it. I quoted James Robertson. I quote him a lot. It's a key quote. I just quote him all the time. James Robertson did the work in the 1950s trying to change hospital policies to let parents stay with their children. Any of you have heard me present will have heard me talk about this. And it was extraordinarily difficult. I actually think we're repeating that now. So there was emerging evidence about the damage that was being done by separating children from their parents in hospitals. And they were trying to find ways to get the system to shift. And he was very frustrated. He made films about it. You know, it was basically our problem now of trying to get hospitals to hear the evidence. And they couldn't because they were in so much denial about the damage they were doing. And so in 1970, he gave this lecture that everybody's forgotten that I think is really seminal lecture. And he said, he quoted what he came to his conclusion, which was this. Here is the problem in his view. Although there is everywhere goodwill and good intention towards young children, progress in work with children stagnates because of the adult's common defense against pain, which allows the acuteness of children's problems to be dulled as if by a tranquilizer. The major obstacle to suitable care is neither practical difficulty nor lack of knowledge. It is that whatever level of intellectual understanding may obtain throughout the professions, the appropriate sense of urgency and alarm is missing. And I find it really, I feel nauseous today. I've been in so many meetings today. I am nauseous about the thought of the harm that is being done to children. And that level of distress is appropriate. And it's the opposite of what Robertson is saying. He's saying that a system and the people in the system protect their own distress by denying children's distress. And so that I think that is part of what is happening. I've been having private message chats with 2 teachers here tonight. Thank you to both of them who feel like they can say to me what they are coping with, but they can't even say it out loud to the whole of this group.
And that's terrible. Mm.
So I want to say thank you to both of you who've chosen to say that. But what I'm trying to say is people are scared, and right? So teachers are scared. The system makes it, one of the things I think we should be asking is, what are people scared of? How is the system constraining people? Because it's not that we don't have the evidence. I think we need to be asking, why are we in denial of the harm that is being done to children? Because all of you know this, when they are harmed in their early years, they are harmed for the rest of their life. And that's happening while we are here. Now, I know all of us are trying to do this, but this is nuts. But it is what Robertson also faced. So I don't know what we do. I think we need to talk about harm. I think we need to talk about denial. I think Gavin Williamson doesn't care. Okay, or you would listen to the fact that damage is being done. So understanding, I think, that other motivations are at play helps come up with more effective solutions.
Do you think, though, Suzanne, that governments want people who are scared?
It is important to understand, I know I'm not even finishing my sentences. It's because I feel so ill. Okay, but understanding the problem is really important for the solutions. So
but if governments want people who are scared, then that's the reason, isn't it?
Well, can I say, I think they want them to comply. I think they like compliant people.
Then
And you have to, and they're, it's, you know, it's pure behaviorism. You have to scare people to make them comply.
I mean,
They have to be scared of something, and they're all scared as well because of the upbringing. And, you know, I mean, this is ACEs, isn't it? Because of the upbringing and background that they have. So the only way they're going to control populations is to clamp down on them, to make them obedient, to make them scared. So I don't think he probably would get through to Williamson in that sense, because what he wants is a population that he can control.
so then those of us who are here tonight need to understand that and think about that and face up to it and contemplate. If that is the problem, that's different than people not understanding the evidence.
I think that neoliberal governments want people who are scared, and the whole thing works on being scared. It works on I mean, through social media, I've written about this. Effectively, you're making mothers scared that they're not doing right by their children. You're making teachers scared that they're not teaching the right thing or the right way. You're making children scared that they're not going to pass the test, and so on and so forth. So everybody goes through life scared, and people who are scared are easily manipulated. I mean, sorry for being so cynical, but that's
but
what
the
I think.
politicians are fearful as well. I mean, I do think that, and I think a lot of the time it's not as well thought through as that. You know, I think there's a lot of contradictory things. They'll also say they want people to be confident, they want people to be entrepreneurial, you know, it's a whole list of things like that. I mean, I think it's very contradictory.
Yeah, but that's only the people from the top, from what they'd see as the top drawer. That's who's allowed to be entrepreneurial.
Can I butt in? Because there's a really interesting thing, because it's somebody on the chat box has said, realizing the ambition may give us the green light for play in primary one. But does this match the expectations of HMIE? If so, why do they still ask for attainment figures at the end of primary one as part of their inspection?
The whole thing, we're just getting, it's all doublethink, isn't it? Everything gets us back to this doublethink, and a catch-22 constantly. So I agree with Suzanne. I think that the more we are aware of it, the more we can come up with arguments that eventually, you know, crack through. And I actually think we're on the verge of making a change in Scotland. I'm very sorry for England, because I think we're far from being on the verge. But I mean, if we could,
there's a lovely, somebody's just said that the primary 1 and 2s have made an amazing transition back to school in Scotland. And it's because they're doing play pedagogy, and she's got a great team that she's working with. So I thought we would want to end on a positive note.
And Marguerite has put something earlier and saying that there's more emphasis on a play summer rather than a catching up summer in Scotland, which is
in England it's a totally catching up
in the summer.
I would
there are some positives there.
I would like to say that I've been involved in quite a few conversations this week about children returning, and I think that this is if we can grasp it, it's a real opportunity to change something. We've lost the Key Stage 1, the Key Stage 2 testing in England. It's for those schools that are willing to do it. They can really do something different this year. And the other thing is, we've had to really look carefully at what teaching and learning looks like this year. In a way, we've had a chance to examine that for the first time in a very long time. And the whole in the pockets where it looks rich, it's where families and carers have been involved in that process, where schools have had to work in collaboration with those families and carers to see what that is seamlessness, that business about the home learning. I hate the business about homeschooling. I think that's a dreadful term. The home learning, where that's been supported, it's been incredibly powerful. And some schools I know are biting the bullet and getting on with making some really big changes and thinking very hard about the transition to secondary school when you haven't got that business with the SATs, the test scores sort of being passed on. So I think there are some positives in the face of a lot of something which has been none of us ever thought we'd have to live through. And those things have kept me going a bit. But yes, there is a lot of depressing stuff. Yeah.
I think parents are also catching on to, and again, maybe I'm talking more about England here, I don't know, catching on to some of the ways that children are taught, and that, they're amazed at things like the grammar that 7-year-olds are doing and the maths, and, so I think that might work in, against governments in that sense. But I mean, I think you've got most of your government in Scotland on side, haven't you?
No, we unfortunately, because that flagship policy of the testing was announced just after we'd launched, and our First Minister sort of nailed her colours to the mast of it. That cannot be stopped unless they make, the famous U-turn, which, in spite of having once been voted down in Parliament on the testing, they weren't going to do. So there's still this double think going on, which I don't know. I think we should get back to what Suzannes started the first book group off with, which was COVID as an opportunity, and try to take that positive line that has been going.
But you have that dichotomy in Scotland, don't you, where you have, you are being listened to, where in England we're simply being dismissed. Yeah. So the answer is come and live in Scotland, isn't it?
or send a Play is the Way book to every English MP with a Just Giving campaign. Right?
Yeah, I don't know how many it would work with. That's the problem. But, I mean, you've got a lot probably to be optimistic about in Scotland.
I mean, I think there's no doubt we are making progress. That's all we can say. It's slower than we would like, but it's happening. I see from the chat box a number of people saying that we need to be engaging with politicians a bit more, much as though they're also disparaging about them. But I think there is something in that. And I think that we should talk about how we can face-to-face put forward some of these really compelling arguments. I think in many cases, they just don't know them. And
I think you could ask the question in Scotland, well, why are you testing?
I think we've asked that.
Just keep going, but you have got some give there, haven't you?
Yes.
We could revisit it again.
Anyway, I think we should draw it to a close now. It's been a really interesting set of presentations and discussion, and roll on the third book group. I take it there is a third one. Yes. And that's when, Sue?
Fortnight.
In a fortnight.
And it's Lisa McCabe and Marguerite Hunter-Blair.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Good night.